In our last video, I considered the similarities between short stories and jokes. Well, a roller coaster gives us another analogy for the structure of a short story. Imagine you set off on this roller coaster and you begin climbing, creaking higher and higher, perhaps enjoying the view. Through much of the ride, not very much is happening, but you're certainly not bored. In fact, your excitement is building all the time, because the higher you get, the further and more dramatic will be the plunge. And of course, the moment at which you're going to plunge is getting closer all the time. So the structure of a story is a bit like a roller coaster. Crucially, just like the roller coaster that climbs higher and higher before the climactic moment, a story must intensify. It must escalate. If on the first page the protagonist feels a bit reflective, then by the fifth page they probably feel an intensely melancholic nostalgia. Up, up, up goes the roller coaster. The pressure builds inside the reader, and at the top there is a climactic release, a thrilling plunge into something new. Well, we know what happens at the apex of a roller coaster, but what usually happens at the apex of a literary short story? Well, I've spoken before about how most stories chart a fundamental journey of the protagonist. A short story only matters if its events, which are often private, domestic matters of no great significance, have some lasting impact. So they describe moments of change, and they're perhaps a little bit of a trick in this regard, because I suspect that in real life we change very gradually as a consequence of myriad events. And yet short stories remind us that however complex our whole lives are, they are made up only of many small instances. According to Richard Ford, the form lends itself to acceptable expressions of caution. You're not paying enough attention to your life, parcelled out as it is in increments smaller and more significant than you seem aware of. So most stories achieve their effect by just hinting that the events described have had some profound impact on the protagonist, and this impact usually relates to some fundamental theme. So, for instance, maybe the protagonist has always been closed to love. Well, perhaps by the end of the story, they've opened themselves to the possibility of real human connection. Or maybe we see at the end that they've resisted the possibility of change. Maybe they had a chance to open themselves to human connection, but for better or worse, they have remained closed to love. Now, the point at which this transition or lack of transition becomes apparent is always at the end. That's where we see what impact the story has had on the protagonist. And the revelation of the impact almost always has to be made concrete. This is the key moment. The protagonist does something. It has to be something that they actively do or don't do. It can't be something another character does. It can't be something that's done to the protagonist. It is only through their active doing that we can see where the real heart of the story lies. And crucially, what the protagonist does at the end of a story is usually something they could never have done at the start of the story. But the authors prepared the moment so that when it happens, the action is not only believable, but seems, for that character at that moment, to be an inevitable gesture. And this revelation surprises us. Now, perhaps that maybe sounds a wee bit abstract and vague. I will give you some specific concrete examples in a minute, but first I have to say that when I came up with this theory, I was pretty chuffed with myself. But of course it turns out that Flannery O'Connor said something similar several decades before I was even born. She said that I often ask myself what makes a short story work and what makes it hold up as a story. And I've decided that it is probably some action, some gesture of a character that is unlike any other in the story, one which indicates where the real heart of the story lies. This would have to be an action or gesture which was both totally right and totally unexpected. It would have to be one that was both in character and beyond character. It would have to suggest both the world and eternity. Some examples. Okay, Tim O'Brien's short story, The Things They Carry, great Vietnam story. It's about, the protagonist is Lieutenant Jimmy Cross. And at the start of the story, he is carrying letters from a sweetheart back home, a girl called Martha. And these letters are sort of the thing that keep him going. During the course of the story, he is exposed to various violence and brutality, the horrors of war. And at the end of the story, he's changed. And we see this change through the fact that he burns those letters. He closes himself to love. He hardens. And of course this reinforces the themes of the horrors of war and the dehumanizing effects of conflict. Or an example from a totally different type of story, John Updike's Here Come the Maples. This is a story about Richard and Joan who are getting divorced. They've had a long, happy marriage, but now it's time to separate. And at the start of the story, Richard recalls that, with some embarrassment, that on their wedding day, he forgot to kiss his wife. Had the whole marriage been a mistake? And yet, as the story goes on, he reflects on the marriage and remembers so many happy things, that even though it is time to separate, he learns to be grateful for this episode in his life, for this great human connection at the centre of his adult life. At the end of the story, he does what he forgot to do when they got married. Just after they get divorced, he kisses his ex-wife. The lawyers sagged with relief at a torrent of merry chit-chat, speculations about the future of No Fault, reminiscences of the old day of Alabama quickies, excluded the Maples. Obsolete at their own ceremony, Joan and Richard stepped back from the bench in unison and stood side by side, uncertain of how to turn, until Richard at last remembered what to do. He kissed her. One final point. Because the magic gesture is so important, it's usually preceded by a short delay. In this regard, it's again very similar to the punchline of a joke. So you note how the short and percussive resolution, he kissed her, is built up with a complex sentence. We have a participle clause, a main clause, two subordinated clauses, until Richard at last remembered what to do. He kissed her. And you can find similar magic gestures in most short stories, I think. But before I sign off, a disclaimer, which is that I do say most short stories. You know, art can't be explained by rules. And yet, as teachers, I guess we kind of have to try. Thanks a lot for watching, and good luck with your writing.